The boy stood on a wooden crate in the center of the barn, his wrists bound with frayed rope behind his back, his bare feet caked in dust. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old. His shirt hung in strips from his thin shoulders, and dark bruises spread across his ribs like storm clouds. His head was tilted downward, chin pressed against his chest, hair falling over his face in matted strands. He didn't cry, he didn't beg. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like a fence post battered by too many seasons. "Lot 17, the auctioneer called out, his voice thick with tobacco and indifference. He stood beside the boy with a wooden rod, tapping it against the edge of the crate. Young, strong enough if you feed him proper, no family, no claims, came off a burned-out homestead near the Salt Fork, been through 3 owners already, but he's still breathing." A few men chuckled. Others leaned forward, squinting through the haze of lantern smoke and dust. The barn smelled like sweat, wet straw, and something darker, fear maybe, or shame. The boy flinched when the auctioneer tapped the rod against his leg. "Don't much talk," the man continued, "but he'll work if you make him. Bidding starts at $20. A young girl in a blue calico dress tugged on her father's sleeve. She couldn't have been older than 8, her face round and curious beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet. "Can we buy that boy, Daddy?" she asked, her voice bright and innocent, cutting through the low rumble of men's voices like a knife. Her father, a broad-shouldered rancher with a clean hat and polished boots, glanced down at her and smiled. "Maybe, sweetheart, let's see." The boy on the crate didn't look up, but his shoulders tensed just slightly as if bracing for another blow. At the back of the barn, near the open double doors where the evening light leaked in like spilled honey, a man stood perfectly still. His name was Callan Pierce, 42 years old, lean and weathered, with a scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, a reminder of a war that had ended 6 years ago but never really stopped. He wore a dusty coat, a flat-brimmed hat, and boots that had walked 1,000 miles without rest. He had come to this place looking for cattle. Word had spread through the territory that a livestock auction was happening in a barn outside of Red Bluff, a nameless prairie town that had sprung up after the war like a weed in cracked stone. Callan needed 3 good heifers and maybe a bull if the price was fair. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to see children being sold like livestock. His hand rested on the frame of the barn door, knuckles white. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He wanted to turn around, wanted to walk back to his horse, ride west, and forget this place existed, but his boots stayed planted in the dirt. Because when the boy on the crate finally lifted his head, just for a moment, just long enough to glance toward the open door where the fading sunlight touched the shadows, Callan saw his face. And the world stopped. The boy had pale gray eyes, a small scar above his left eyebrow shaped like a crescent moon, a stubborn line to his mouth even through the bruises. His nose was crooked, broken once and never set right. Callan knew that face. He had watched it every morning for the first 7 years of his life. He had held it in his hands when the boy was born, red-faced and screaming, in a one-room cabin on the edge of the Missouri frontier. He had taught him to ride before he could write his name, had carved him a wooden horse, had promised him a future. That boy's name was Ethan. Ethan Pierce. Callan's son. His breath stopped in his chest, his vision narrowed. The noise of the barn, the auctioneer's voice, the shuffle of boots, the clink of coins faded into a dull hum. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat, thick and slow, like a drum in a funeral march. Ethan was supposed to be dead. 5 years ago, Callan had left his family on a small homestead near the Salt Fork River to ride south and settle a land claim dispute. It should have taken 3 weeks. It took 2 months. When he finally returned, the cabin was burned to the foundation. The fields were scorched. The livestock were gone. And in the middle of the ash and ruin, he found 2 graves, shallow, unmarked, hastily dug. The neighbors told him what had happened. Raiders, ex-Confederate guerrillas still waging their own private wars. They had come at night, torched the place, and left nothing behind but smoke and silence. They told him his wife, Mary, and his son, Ethan, were dead, burned or shot, no one knew for sure. The bodies had been too charred to tell. Callan had buried what was left. He had carved 2 crosses from cottonwood. He had knelt in the dirt and wept until his throat bled. And then he had ridden away. He never went back. For 5 years, he had carried that weight. For 5 years, he had believed his son was ash and bone scattered across a riverbank in a territory that didn't care. But now, standing in this barn, watching a boy with his son's face, standing on a crate with his hands bound, Callan understood the truth. Ethan hadn't died in that fire. He had been taken. The auctioneer's voice cut through the silence like a rusty blade. $20, do I hear 20? The rancher with the little girl raised his hand. 20. 25, another man called older, with a long beard and a cruel mouth. Callan's legs moved before his mind caught up. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the packed dirt floor, his breath shallow and sharp. Men turned to look at him. The auctioneer squinted through the smoke. 30, Callan said. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was too quiet, too flat. The auctioneer grinned. $30, do I hear 35? The bearded man frowned, then nodded. 35. 40, Callan said. The rancher with the girl hesitated, then shook his head and stepped back. The bearded man scowled but said nothing. The auctioneer tapped his rod against the crate. $40 going once, twice. Callan's heart hammered in his chest. His eyes locked on the boy, on Ethan, but the boy didn't look at him, didn't recognize him. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe 5 years had erased too much. Sold, the auctioneer said, slapping the rod against his palm. $40 to the man in the back. Callan didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stood there, staring at the boy on the crate, at the son he thought he had buried, at the ghost that had come back to life in the worst way possible. And Ethan, still bound, still silent, finally looked up. Their eyes met across the smoke and the shadows. And for just a moment, something flickered in the boy's expression. Confusion, maybe, or recognition buried, so deep it hurt to surface. Then it was gone. The auctioneer waved Callan forward. Come settle your account, friend, he's all yours. Callan forced his legs to move, forced himself to walk toward the front of the barn, toward the boy who didn't remember him, toward the son he had failed to protect. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know how to explain, didn't know if Ethan would even believe him. But he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving this place without him. Not again. Callan counted out the money in silence. $40 in crumpled bills and coins laid across the auctioneer's weathered palm. The man didn't bother counting it twice. He just stuffed it into his vest pocket and gestured toward the boy with the rod. He's yours, no refunds, no complaints. You break him, you keep him. Callan didn't answer. He stepped past the man and moved toward the crate. Ethan stood motionless, his head lowered again, his wrists still bound. Up close, Callan could see the details he had missed from the back of the barn, the split skin on the boy's knuckles, the burn scar on his forearm, the way his breathing was shallow and uneven, like every breath cost him something. Callan reached for the rope around the boy's wrists. His hands were shaking. He hated that they were shaking. Hold still, he said quietly. Ethan flinched but didn't pull away. Callan worked the knot loose, rough hemp, tied too tight, biting into the skin, and let the rope fall to the dirt. The boy's wrists were raw, red, and swollen. He rubbed them slowly, his face still turned down, his eyes hidden beneath the tangle of his hair. Callan wanted to say something, wanted to reach out and lift the boy's chin, make him look, make him see, but the words wouldn't come. They stuck in his throat like broken glass. Instead, he pulled off his coat and draped it over Ethan's shoulders. The boy stiffened, surprised, but didn't push it away. The coat was too big, hanging past his knees, but it covered the torn shirt and the bruises. Come on, Callan said. His voice was hoarse. Let's get out of here. Ethan didn't move. Callan waited. Around them the barn was emptying, men leading horses, dragging crates, hauling off the things they had bought. No one looked at them. No one cared. You gonna stand there all night? Callan asked, softer this time. Ethan lifted his head just enough to glance at him. His eyes were grey and flat, like stones at the bottom of a river. He didn't speak. Callan crouched down so they were eye level. He kept his hands loose, open, non-threatening. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said. "I'm not like them." The boy's jaw tightened. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, finally, barely a whisper, "They all say that." The words hit Callan like a fist to the chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing through the pain. When he opened them again, Ethan was watching him, wary and small and impossibly far away. "I know," Callan said, "but I mean it." Ethan didn't answer, but after a long moment, he stepped down from the crate, his bare feet landing in the dirt. He wrapped the coat tighter around himself and stood. "They're waiting." Callan stood too. He turned toward the barn door, and Ethan followed, slow, hesitant, like a dog that had been kicked too many times. They walked out into the fading light. The sun was sinking behind the low hills, streaking the sky with orange and red. Callan's horse, a grey mare named Ash, was tied to a post near the edge of the yard. She snorted softly when she saw him, ears flicking forward. Callan stopped beside her and looked back at Ethan. The boy stood a few feet away, staring at the ground, his hands buried in the folds of the coat. "Can you ride?" Callan asked. Ethan nodded. "Good." Callan untied the reins and swung up into the saddle. Then he reached down, offering his hand. "Come on." Ethan hesitated. His eyes flicked from Callan's hand to his face and back again. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and took it. Callan pulled him up, settling him in front of the saddle. Ethan sat stiff and silent, his shoulders tight, his hands gripping the saddle horn like it was the only solid thing in the world. Callan nudged Ash into a walk. They rode west, away from the barn, away from the town, into the open prairie where the grass swayed like water and the sky stretched wide and empty. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, as the last of the light bled from the sky and the stars began to prick through the darkness, Callan finally said what he'd been holding back since the moment he saw the boy's face. "Your name is Ethan." The boy went rigid, his breathing hitched. He didn't turn around, but Callan felt the change in him, the sudden tension, the sharp edge of fear or confusion or something deeper. "You don't remember me," Callan continued, his voice low and steady, "but I remember you. I'm your father." Silence, just the soft thud of hooves on dirt, the whisper of wind through the grass. Then Ethan spoke, his voice small and hard. "My father's dead." Callan's throat tightened. "That's what they told you." "My father died in the fire, my mother too." "Your mother did," Callan said quietly. "I found her grave, but you didn't die, Ethan. They took you, and I thought you were gone." Ethan shook his head, sharp and angry. "No, you're lying. You bought me, that's all. You don't know me." "I know the scar above your left eye," Callan said. "You got it when you were 4. You climbed up on the fence and fell off, hit your head on a rock. Your mother nearly fainted. I carried you inside and stitched it myself. You didn't cry once." Ethan's hands trembled on the saddle horn. "I know you broke your nose when you were 6, Callan continued. "You were trying to ride a calf in the barn. Damn thing bucked you straight into a post. I wanted to reset it, but you wouldn't let me touch you for 2 days." "Stop," Ethan whispered. "I know your favorite food was cornbread with honey. I know you used to sit on the porch steps and watch the stars and ask me their names. I know." "Stop." Callan stopped. He pulled Ash to a halt. The prairie stretched out around them, dark and silent. He could feel Ethan shaking in front of him, could hear the uneven rasp of his breathing. "I looked for you," Callan said, his voice breaking. "For 2 years I looked. I rode to every town, every camp, every burned-out settlement. I asked everyone. No one knew anything. No one had seen a boy, so I stopped looking, and I'm sorry." Ethan turned his head, just enough that Callan could see his profile in the starlight. His face was wet. His jaw was clenched. "You left," Ethan said. "You left us." "I know. And they came, and they burned everything, and she," his voice cracked, "she screamed, and I couldn't. Callan closed his eyes. I know. You don't know, Ethan said, his voice raw and fierce. You weren't there. You're right, Callan whispered. I wasn't, and I'll carry that every day until I'm in the ground. Ethan didn't answer. He just sat there, shaking, staring out into the dark. Callan tightened his grip on the reins. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving you again. The boy said nothing, but he didn't pull away. And for now, that was enough. They made camp in a shallow draw where a line of cottonwoods grew thick along a dry creek bed. Callan built a small fire, just enough for warmth, and a pot of coffee. Ethan sat on the far side of the flames, wrapped in the coat, staring into the coals. He hadn't spoken since their conversation on the trail. Callan didn't push. He knew better. Words wouldn't fix this. Time might not either. But silence was something he could offer, and for now, it seemed like the only thing Ethan wanted. Callan poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out. Ethan glanced at it, but didn't reach for it. Callan set it on a flat stone near the boy's feet and went back to his own side of the fire. They sat like that for a long time, two shadows on opposite sides of a dying flame. Then Ash snorted. Callan's head snapped up. The mare was standing tense at the edge of the firelight, ears pie. And Ned back, nostrils flaring. He stood slowly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, he said to Ethan. He stepped into the darkness beyond the fire, his eyes adjusting to the pale starlight. The prairie stretched out flat and still, but something was wrong. The air felt different, charged, like the moment before a storm. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats slow and steady, coming from the east. Callan drew his revolver and moved toward Ash, keeping low. The hoofbeats grew louder, 3 riders, maybe 4. They were moving deliberately, not in a hurry, like men who knew exactly where they were going. Callan's stomach tightened. The riders came into view at the top of the draw, silhouetted against the stars. They stopped at the ridge, looking down at the camp. One of them, a tall man on a black horse, raised a hand. Callan Pierce, the man called out. His voice was smooth, educated, and cold. Been a long time. Callan didn't answer. He stayed in the shadows, his gun steady. The man nudged his horse forward, descending into the draw. The others followed. As they came closer, the firelight caught their faces. The tall man wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was sharp and clean-shaven, his eyes pale and empty. Callan recognized him immediately. Silas Merrick. A name Callan hadn't heard in 5 years, a name he had tried to forget. Silas Merrick had been a Union officer during the war, a captain in a regiment that operated in the Missouri frontier. Officially, they were tasked with keeping order in the territories. Unofficially, they burned homesteads, seized land, and sold whatever they could, livestock, supplies, people, to anyone who would pay. After the war, Merrick had stayed in the territory. He set himself up as a land agent, brokering deals, running auctions, taking cuts from every transaction. He was the man behind the barn, the man who had turned Ethan into a number on a crate. And 5 years ago, Merrick had been the one who gave the order to burn Callan's homestead. Callan's hand tightened on the revolver. Merrick stopped his horse a few yards from the fire. He smiled, thin and sharp. You bought something of mine tonight. He's not yours, Callan said. He was until you paid $40 for him, fair and legal. Merrick tilted his head. But there's been a complaint. Seems the boy's last owner wasn't quite done with him. Says he ran off, caused some trouble. Man wants him back. Then the man can go to hell. Merrick chuckled. You always had a temper, Pierce, but temper doesn't hold up in court, or in a draw for that matter. The other riders shifted in their saddles. 2 of them had rifles across their laps. The third had his hand resting on a holstered pistol. Callan didn't move. You think I'm giving him back? I think you're going to be smart, Merrick said. You rode away from your life 5 years ago. You didn't ask questions. You didn't make trouble. That's why you're still breathing. But if you start making noise now, if you start asking where that boy came from or who took him or why, he leaned forward, his smile fading. Then you're going to find out how quickly people forget you ever existed. Callan's jaw clenched. You took him. Merrick shrugged. I took a lot of things. That's what war is, Pierce. Opportunity. You were gone. Your wife was alone. The boy was young and strong. It made sense. You told everyone he was dead. And you believed it. Merrick straightened in his saddle. So here's how this works. You hand the boy over, I'll forget you were ever here, and you ride on. Or you make this difficult, and we settle it the old way. Callan glanced back at the fire. Ethan was still sitting there, staring at Merrick, his face pale and hard. Callan turned back to Merrick. No. Merrick sighed. I was hoping you'd say that. He gestured to the riders. They dismounted, slow and deliberate, spreading out around the camp. One moved toward the fire. Another circled to the left, cutting off the escape route toward the horses. Callan took a step back, his gun still raised. You really want to do this? I really want my property back, Merrick said. He stayed on his horse, watching, and I don't particularly care if you're standing when I take it. The rider near the fire reached for Ethan. The boy didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared up at the man with those flat gray eyes. Callan raised his gun. And then a voice, low and rough, cut through the tension like a blade. Touch him, and you'll be dead before you hit the ground. Everyone froze. Callan turned his head. A figure stepped out of the shadows beyond the cottonwoods, an older man, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, with a shotgun cradled in his arms. He walked forward into the firelight, his boots crunching on the dry grass. Behind him, 2 more men emerged. Then 3, then 5. Ranch hands, by the look of them, weathered, hard-faced men with rifles and revolvers, men who had worked the land long enough to decay. Now, when something was wrong. The gray-bearded man stopped beside Callan. He nodded once. Callan. Callan stared at him. Gideon. Gideon Hale, a rancher Callan had worked for years ago, back when he was still trying to build a life. A man who had taught him how to break horses and mend fences and survive the hard seasons. A man Callan hadn't seen since the war. Gideon looked at Merrick. Sealers. Merrick's smile was gone. This doesn't concern you, Gideon. Boys sitting in my camp, Gideon said. That concerns me. This is a legal matter. I don't see a judge. I don't see a warrant. I just see a man trying to steal a child in the middle of the night. Gideon shifted the shotgun, and I don't abide that. The other ranch hands moved closer, forming a loose line between the fire and Merrick's riders. The odds had shifted. Merrick stared at Gideon, then at Callan, then at the boy by the fire. His jaw tightened. Finally, he pulled his horse back. You're making a mistake, he said. Wouldn't be the first time, Gideon replied. Merrick turned his horse and gestured to his men. They mounted up slowly, their eyes hard. Then, without another word, they rode back up the draw and disappeared into the dark. Callan lowered his gun. His hands were shaking again. He looked at Gideon. How did you? Your mare came through my land an hour ago, Gideon said. Saddle was empty. I figured you were either dead or in trouble. Brought some boys just in case. Callan exhaled. Thank you. Gideon nodded. Then he looked at Ethan, still sitting by the fire, and his expression softened. That the boy? Yeah. He yours. Callan's voice cracked. Yeah. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he clapped Callan on the shoulder. Then you'd best keep him close. Merrick doesn't forget. Callan nodded. He walked back to the fire and crouched beside Ethan. The boy looked up at him, his face unreadable. You okay? Callan asked. Ethan didn't answer, but after a moment he nodded. Callan sat down beside him, and for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could keep that promise. Gideon and his men stayed through the night. They kept watch in shifts, rifles ready, eyes on the horizon. No one came. By dawn, the prairie was quiet again, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Gideon made coffee over the fire and handed a cup to Callan. They sat together in silence, watching the sun rise. You planning to stay in the territory? Gideon asked. Callan shook his head. Can't, not with Merrick around. Where'll you go? West, maybe Colorado, somewhere far enough that he won't bother following. Gideon nodded. You'll need supplies, money. I'll manage. I'm not asking. Gideon stood and gestured to one of his men. Get him a bedroll, some food, and $50 from the ranch fund. Callan started to protest, but Gideon held up a hand. You worked for me for 3 years, Callan, never asked for more than you earned, never caused trouble. Consider it back pay. Callan's throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, just take care of that boy. Gideon and his men left an hour later, riding back toward the ranch. Callan packed up the camp, loaded ash, and turned to Ethan. The boy was sitting on a flat rock, his bare feet dangling, the coat still wrapped around him. He watched Callan with those grey eyes, wary but less guarded than before. Callan walked over and crouched in front of him. He pulled a pair of worn boots from his saddlebag, too big, but they'd do, and set them on the ground. Found these at the ranch, Callan said. They'll keep your feet warm. Ethan stared at the boots, but didn't reach for them. Callan sat down beside him. You don't have to trust me yet, he said quietly, but I need you to know something. I'm not going to sell you, I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to leave you. Ethan's jaw tightened. You left before. I did, and I've thought about that every day since. I should have been there, I should have. Callan stopped, his voice breaking. I should have kept you safe, and I didn't, but I'm here now, and I'm asking you to let me try. Ethan looked away, his hands twisted in the fabric of the coat. Why? Because you're my son. That doesn't mean anything, Ethan said, his voice small and hard. Not anymore. Callan nodded slowly. Maybe not, but it means something to me. They sat in silence for a long time. The wind moved through the grass. The sun climbed higher. Ash grazed nearby, her tail flicking at flies. Finally, Ethan spoke. Where are we going? West, Callan said. Away from here, somewhere you can start over. And then what? Callan hesitated. I don't know, I guess we figure it out as we go. Ethan looked at him, searching his face for something, truth, maybe, or a reason to believe. Then, slowly, he reached down and picked up the boots. He pulled them on, one at a time, lacing them with careful, deliberate movements. Callan. En watched him, something loosening in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't trust, but it was a start. They rode west through the morning, following the line of the creek. Callan kept the pace slow, mindful of Ethan's silence, of the way the boy's shoulders stayed tense, ready to bolt at any moment. Around midday, they stopped to rest. Callan pulled out the food Gideon's men had packed, dried beef, cornbread, a few apples. He handed an apple to Ethan. The boy took it, but didn't eat. He just turned it over in his hands, staring at it. You remember anything, Callan asked, from before? Ethan shook his head. Not much, just pieces, sounds, mostly her voice, the fire, the way the horses screamed. Callan's chest ached. Your mother loved you more than anything. Ethan's hands stilled. I know. She would have fought for you. I know she did. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. She did, and they killed her anyway. Callan closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Ethan didn't respond. He just sat there, holding the apple, his face turned away. After a moment, Callan spoke again. You know, you used to love apples. You'd eat 3 in a row if I let you. Your mother said you'd turn into one if you weren't careful. Ethan glanced at him, something flickering in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. She was right about a lot of things, Callan continued. She was smarter than me, that's for sure. She's the one who taught you to read. I could barely write my own name. Ethan looked down at the apple. Then, slowly, he took a bite. Callan watched him, something warm and fragile settling in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. So here's the question that changes everything. If you were Callan, would you have walked into that barn? Would you have taken the boy, knowing what it might cost? And if you're still with me, tap subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? and what would you have done? They rode on. The prairie stretched wide and golden around them. Ethan sat in front of the saddle, no longer gripping it like a lifeline. His shoulders were still tense, but less so. And when Callan pointed out a hawk circling overhead, Ethan looked up. He didn't say anything, but he looked. And for Callan, that was enough. They reached the foothills of the Rockies 3 weeks later. The land was different here, greener, rougher, with pine trees climbing the slopes and cold streams cutting through the valleys. Callan found work at a small ranch owned by a widow named Clara Tate. She needed hands for the season, no questions asked. Callan took the job, and Ethan stayed with him. At first, the boy didn't do much. He sat on the porch steps and watched the horizon or wandered the edges of the property, silent and restless. But slowly, over days and then weeks, he began to settle. One morning, Callan found him in the barn, brushing down ash. The boy's movements were careful, practiced. He didn't look up when Callan entered, just kept working, his hands steady on the brush. Callan leaned against the stall door. "You remember how to do that?" Ethan nodded. "You taught me when I was little." Callan's throat tightened. "Yeah, I did." Ethan paused, his hand resting on Ash's flank. "I remember other things too, not a lot, but some." "Like what?" "The way you used to carve things, little animals. You made me a horse." Callan's chest ached. "You still have it." Ethan shook his head. "It burned." "I'll make you another one." Ethan glanced at him, something uncertain in his eyes. Then he went back to brushing. Callan watched him for a moment longer, then turned to leave. But before he reached the door, Ethan spoke again. "Did you really look for me?" Callan stopped. He didn't turn around. "Every day for 2 years." "Why'd you stop?" "Because I thought you were dead, and I couldn't keep looking at Grav." Ethan was quiet, then softly, "I'm not dead." Callan turned. Ethan was standing in the middle of the barn, the brush in his hand, his face pale and serious. "No," Callan said, his voice thick, "you're not." They stood there, father and son, separated by 5 years and a barn full of silence. Then Ethan set the brush down and walked toward him. He stopped a few feet away, his hands loose at his sides. "I don't know if I can," he trailed off, searching for words. "I don't know if I can be who I was before." Callan shook his head. "You don't have to be, you just have to be you." Ethan's jaw trembled. "What if I don't know who that is anymore?" "Then we'll figure it out together." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. A month later, riders came. Callan was mending a fence line when he saw them, 3 men on horseback, moving up the valley road. His stomach tightened. He set down the hammer and walked back toward the ranch house, keeping his rifle close. Clara Tate was on the porch, shading her eyes against the sun. "You expectin'?" "Gee, trouble." "I'm always expecting trouble," Callan said. But when the riders came closer, Callan recognized the man in front. It wasn't Merrick, it was Gideon Hale. Callan lowered his rifle. Gideon dismounted, his face grim. "What's wrong?" Callan asked. "Merrick's dead," Gideon said. Callan blinked. "What?" "Shot 3 days ago, found him in his office in Red Bluff. Someone put 2 bullets in his chest and walked out the front door. No witnesses." Callan's mind raced. "Who?" "Don't know, don't care." Gideon looked at him. "But the law's asking questions. They're looking for people who had reason. Your name came up." Callan's stomach dropped. "I didn't." "I know, I told them you've been here for a month." Clara backed it up. "But they're not done. They're going to keep looking." Callan glanced back at the house. Ethan was standing in the doorway, watching. "What do I do?" Callan asked. "You stay put," Gideon said. "Let it blow over. Merrick had a lot of enemies. Someone else will take the blame eventually." Callan nodded slowly. "Thank you." Gideon mounted his horse. "Take care of that boy, Callan. He's lucky to have you." Callan watched them ride away. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Ethan was still standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Is he dead?" Ethan asked. Callan stopped. Yeah. Ethan didn't say anything. He just looked at Callan, his grey eyes steady, then he stepped back inside. Callan stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. He didn't know if Ethan had anything to do with Merrick's death. He didn't want to know. Some questions didn't need answers. Winter came, and with its snow, the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm. Callan and Ethan worked side by side, mending fences, feeding livestock, cutting firewood. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. One evening, Callan sat by the fire, carving. Ethan sat across from him, watching. After a while, Callan held up a small wooden horse, rough but recognizable. "Here," he said, handing it to Ethan. Ethan took it, turning it over in his hands. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "It's crooked." "Like your nose," Callan said. Ethan looked at him, and then, for the first time since Callan had found him, he laughed. It was quiet, rusty, like something that hadn't been used in years, but it was real. Callan smiled. "There you are." Ethan looked down at the horse, his fingers tracing the rough edges. "Thanks." "Anytime." They sat together by the fire, the snow falling softly outside, the world quiet and still. Callan didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the ghosts would ever fully leave them or if the scars would ever fade. But for now they had this, a fire, a roof, each other. And that was enough. Years later, people would ask Ethan what he remembered most about that time. He would think for a long moment, staring into the distance, before answering. "I remember the way he looked at me in that barn," he'd say, "like the world had stopped, like I was the only thing that mattered." And when they asked him if he forgave his father for leaving, for not being there when it mattered, Ethan would shake his head. "I don't know if forgiveness works that way," he'd say, "but I know he tried, and that was enough." The wooden horse still sat on a shelf in his home, crooked and worn, a reminder of the man who had come back, the man who had stayed, the man who had carved a new life from the ashes of the old. And every time Ethan looked at it, he would remember the words his father had spoken in that barn, under the smoke and the shadows. "That's my son,"